Hello there. My name is Glenn Morris, and I'm part of the St. Peter's family, married to Anne-Marie, and we have 4 kids. I work with the Navigators, and the Navigators is an organization that helps people to live out their faith in all the places and stages of life, and not just for them to live it out, but for them to also help other people as well on their faith journey to find and follow Jesus. Well, most of my work, well, actually all of my work, is in Asia Pacific. So normally in a year, I'd be away traveling for maybe 100 days or so a year. But I wasn't traveling last year, and I'm not traveling this year either. So it'll be a couple of years at least for me of doing lots of Zoom calls and emails and other bits and pieces to keeping me busy. Well, Mike asked me to share on these verses in Matthew. So Mike started this series a few weeks ago, looking at Matthew 4 onwards. And then last week, Keith spoke on Matthew 4, verses 12 to 25. So now this week, I'll be talking on the opening verses of the Sermon on the Mount, which is often called the Beatitudes. These are verses 1 to 12. Before getting into this, although I wanted to give a little bit of background to the Sermon on the Mount before talking about these introductory verses. So first of all, the Sermon on the Mount, which is chapters 5 to 7, is one of 5 large blocks of Jesus' speech in Matthew's Gospel. And Matthew's Gospel is a very Jewish, or comes from a very Jewish perspective. So this Sermon on the Mount was addressed to all Israel gathered together to hear Jesus. So whether the people were the sick, the poor, people at the margins, or people in the middle, all Israel gathered together. The other thing too is the Sermon on the Mount deals with a range of issues for individuals and the community as a whole. Things such as murder and anger, or lust, divorce, adultery, relating to enemies, judging others, dealing with money. But in all of these things, despite all of these things, it's not primarily about individual ethics or about being a political manifesto. Instead, it's about how Jesus fulfills what the law and the prophets is all about. Jesus also gives some descriptions, some of the flavors of what living in the kingdom is like. How should we relate to one another? How should we relate to God? What should we value as important? What should we be like as children living under God's rule? These are the sorts of issues and questions that Jesus addresses. Now, another thing too that's important to keep in mind is that Jesus, as a teacher, was more aligned to the wisdom teachers rather than to the teachers of the law. Now, the teachers of the law tended to be, if this thing happens, then this is what you do, or this is the result. By contrast, the teachers, the wisdom teachers, were more interested in communicating principles and attitudes rather than legal details. So they might use hyperbole, extreme examples to communicate an idea. And it was more about flavors rather than precise legal details. And just one other background point I wanted to make is that the Sermon on the Mount is about the kingdom of God, but what's important is that it's equally about the family of God in these chapters, chapters 5 to 7. There are at least twice as many references to using family words, such as father, brother, sister, children of God, as compared with using the word kingdom. So it is about the kingdom, but it's not a kingdom of contracted citizens. Instead, it's a kingdom of connected family members. So that's some background about the Sermon on the Mount. Now, let's read these verses in Matthew 5, verses 1 to 12. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So those are the verses we'll be looking at today. And there are many things that could be said and have been said about the Beatitudes. This is a short message, and I really just wanted to share a couple of my own reflections on these Beatitudes as I've been thinking about them over the last couple of weeks. So the two things that strike me is that these Beatitudes are words of hope for those with nothing, and these are words of encouragement for those who are trying to do the right thing. So I'd like to look at these two issues. First of all, Beatitudes of hope. So these are words of hope for those who have nothing else to hope in. So as we look at the ones here and that I've highlighted, blessed are the poor in spirit, those who mourn, or those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. These all have in common the sense that all is not well, because you don't mourn or hunger for something unless things are not as they should be. And the word for poor in the Greek, tokos, it's not just referring to kind of a lower class of people, but it's referring to people who literally have nothing. Jesus uses the term poor in spirit, but in his day, everything was connected. It was a lot more holistic. So the poverty he talked about, it could show up spiritually, relationally, economically, in terms of mental health, or in many other ways. Jesus speaks these words to people whose lives were hard. One of the things that I do is I'm part of the team that does the lunches at St. Peter's on a Tuesday for people on the street. Now, I don't actually make the meals, but on the Tuesday as people come in, one of the people who welcomes people, and then I give a brief message before the meal is served. Normally, I have about 60 seconds maximum. I think that's about as much grace as they'll give me before the meal needs to be served. As I've met people, and a number of them I've known for quite a long time now, I've got to hear their stories, and in some ways you see and feel their pain. They have no money or very little money. A number of them have mental health issues or depression. Some have rough relationships, and just for so many of them, they're in this hole and they don't know how to get out of it. Well, some of these people as well are believers, and one man, I'll call him Thomas. I've got to know him reasonably well, so we met first of all at the lunches, but then we've also connected outside of the lunches as well. So he would talk to me about his sense of emptiness and his desperate need for Jesus. And, some days are good and some days are bad. Some seasons are good and some seasons are bad. But when he would lean on Jesus, he knew how Jesus changed things for him for good. He was very open about his sense of loss and emptiness without Jesus, and how such a big difference he made in his life. I found meeting with Thomas, for me, was so refreshing, but also challenging. But it's not just people on the streets who are hurting badly. Amongst us are people who look okay on the outside, but behind the scenes, maybe some of us struggle with mental health or have bad relationships with our partner or our kids. Or maybe in some other way, we've stuffed up badly and now we feel lost, empty, morally or spiritually bankrupt. To those of us who have felt the gap between how things should be and how things are, these are genuine words of hope from Jesus. In your mourning, you will be comforted. In your hunger for right relationships, you will be filled. In your emptiness, you are blessed. For you have a place in the kingdom. You belong in his family with the one who loves you completely. Now, I have a friend, Michael, who our kids, we had a couple of kids who played sport in the same team. And so we'd often see each other and these weekends as our kids were playing sport, and we'd catch up. And he was a nice fellow, and he had a good job. And he, in many ways, I just didn't sense that he had any sense of need. And I would sometimes wonder to myself, how could this gospel, how could this good news be good news for him? Well, our kids stopped playing in the same team, and so we lost contact for a little while. But a few years later, I got a call from his wife, who asked me to come and meet him at the hospital. So I did. I went in there and he told me his story. He'd had a major health issue. He was in Tauranga Hospital, had been flown up to Auckland Hospital, had literally died on the operating table, had been brought back to life, had gotten a little bit better, so that he was then flown back to Tauranga Hospital, where I was talking to him at the time. And he told me when he was in Auckland, he knew that he wasn't going to die, and he knew that it had something to do with God, and he knew that I had something to do with God. So ... So I said to Michael, well, okay, well, let's start reading. Let's find out a bit more about this God who you don't really know much about. So I would come to visit him, and each week in the hospital, and we started reading through John's Gospel, one chapter at a time, just reading the chapter and asking and answering lots of questions. We worked our way through John's Gospel, and at some point he got well enough to leave the hospital and go back home. And so we carried on meeting at his place, and we went through John's Gospel to Mark's Gospel and onwards. It was probably for about 2 years. Well, eventually Michael's health declined, and he passed away. But before he passed away, he said, some days were not easy. Some days were tough, and he wasn't so sure about things. But he said, fundamentally, deep down, he said, I'm not afraid, and I'm not alone, because Michael believed in God. See, Michael, this person who, to me, looking back a few years before, seemed to have everything together. So he totally lost his health. But in that loss, he was able to find life. Blessed are the poor, those who have nowhere else to go, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Well, for many of us, sometime in our past, we felt our lostness. And so we came to believe in Jesus. But it seems to me that as time goes on, it becomes too easy to take things for granted. Yes, I know I have faults and failures, but in the busyness of everything, I can forget my brokenness and bankruptcy without God. And instead, I try and do everything myself as if it were all up to me. Well, Jesus says the kingdom of heaven belongs to the poor, to those who have absolutely nothing and are utterly lost without Jesus. It's not to those who can get their 80%, but just need a little 20% top up. You and I are in just as much need of Jesus today as when we first believed. Let us not walk away from our first love. This is the heart of the good news. Jesus offers hope to those who don't have any. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So the second thing, I was encouraged by Beatitudes of hope, but also Beatitudes of encouragement. So these words of encouragement are for those who are doing their best to do the right thing. So as we see the ones here that I've highlighted, Jesus praises the meek, the merciful, pure in heart, which is those with integrity or authenticity, the peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for doing what's right. These were all traits that Jesus himself had. In his day, these character traits and ways of living weren't always valued. In our day, they're not really valued either. I think people might say these are good traits for other people to have, but not often these would be many things that people would aspire to for themselves. I think if I had to come up with some Beatitudes for our day that many people would aspire to, I'd suggest something like this. Contented are those who are independent and strong. They will make a mark in this world. Happy are those who have no worries. They'll enjoy life to the full. Fortunate are those who believe in themselves. They'll get ahead of others. Satisfied are those who pursue pleasure. It will lead them to what they want. Fortunate are those who don't get involved with other people's pain. They won't get hurt. Lucky are the attractive and strong. They will be honored. And blessed are the people who come out on top. They will be called favorite sons and daughters. Against these sort of values, Jesus spoke Beatitudes to encourage people to live like him, being humble, showing mercy, being authentic, promoting peace. To do this isn't easy, and it often goes without thanks. And maybe it even creates more difficulty for you than if you never did anything at all. This is hard work. But in these Beatitudes, Jesus encourages his followers to keep at it, not to give up, because in doing so, they take on the family likeness, and theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So, in summary, in such a small number of words, Jesus offers hope to those who don't have any, to those who feel the gap between how things are and how they should be. And he offers encouragement to those who are making small steps in the right direction to live out a godly life, growing in the family likeness. To these people, Jesus offers the kingdom of heaven. So today, let us be people who live in this hope that Jesus gives. Let us be people encouraged to keep going as we grow in the family likeness. For in doing this, ours is the kingdom of heaven.